A leather-bound diary nearly shattered a royal dynasty. Within its pages lay secrets so explosive they threatened to topple a king from his throne. This is the true story of a Gilded Age heiress who entered the world of European royalty only to document its most scandalous truths. By the end, you will understand how a single private journal could challenge an entire institution and change history. We will uncover the hidden affairs, the financial corruption, and the personal vices she recorded. Why did a woman with everything risk it all to write down these dangerous revelations? What does it take for a personal secret to become a political weapon? How much would you risk to tell the truth about the most powerful people in the world? Her name was Consuelo Vanderbilt, and her fortune was the key that unlocked the gilded cage of European nobility. Born into one of America's wealthiest families during the Gilded Age, her life was a whirlwind of Fifth Avenue mansions, private railway cars, and summers in Newport. The Vanderbilts were new money, and in late 19th century America, that meant they had unimaginable wealth, but lacked the one thing old money possessed: social legitimacy. For families like hers, the ultimate symbol of having truly arrived was a royal title. And so, a transaction was arranged, one as old as aristocracy itself. Her family's colossal fortune, estimated in the hundreds of millions by today's standards, was to be traded for a name etched in the annals of European history. She was not merely marrying a man, she was marrying into an institution, a centuries-old dynasty whose power was woven into the very fabric of a nation. This was the price of entry into the highest echelon of society, a world of palaces, courtly rituals, and unimaginable privilege. But what happens when the person who buys the ticket decides to write down everything they see? The man chosen for Consuelo Vanderbilt was the 9th Duke of Marlborough, a British aristocrat whose bloodline traced back to kings. His family seat was Blenheim Palace, a monumental estate more resembling a sovereign nation than a private home. Yet for all its grandeur, the Marlborough dynasty was quietly crumbling, its vast estates and palatial rooms hemorrhaging money. The solution was not to be found in London's banks, but in the vaults of New York's new industrial fortunes. This was the essence of the dollar princess phenomenon, a calculated exchange where American wealth resuscitated European blue blood. For the Vanderbilts, a ducal coronet was the final, glittering proof of their family's ascent. For the Duke, Consuelo's immense dowry was a rescue package, funds that would restore his ancestral home and secure his family's future. But these unions were more than mere social climbing. They were subtle political instruments. By marrying their daughters into Europe's ruling classes, American titans of industry were buying a seat at the oldest table in the world, weaving their new world influence into the old world tapestry of power. It was a transaction dressed as a romance, a merger of two very different kinds of dynasty. One question hung silently in the air, a question none of the architects of this marriage dared to ask aloud. What happens when the prized asset, the young woman at the center of this grand bargain, possesses a mind of her own and a silent, observant eye? The diary arrived as a gift, a beautiful leather-bound volume with a simple lock. Its first pages were filled with the kind of observations any young bride might make. Descriptions of Blenheim Palace's overwhelming scale, and the sheer number of rooms. She wrote of the silence in the grand halls, a quiet so deep it felt heavy. These early entries were not yet angry or accusatory. They were the notes of a stranger in a strange land, trying to map her new reality. She detailed the rigid schedule of her days, the formal meals where conversation was a ritual, not a pleasure. She described the distant figure of her new husband, the Duke, a man more preoccupied with the state ledgers and the restoration of tapestries than with his new wife. The initial tone was one of bewilderment. A young woman from a world of vibrant American energy suddenly immersed in the frozen pageantry of the British aristocracy. She wrote of the weather, the endless gray skies that seemed to match the mood of her new home, a stark contrast to the bright, sun-drenched summers of Newport. She noted the characters that populated this world, the stern household staff governed by ancient rules, and the various relatives who viewed her with a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled judgment. They saw the American fortune, not the American girl. In these seemingly innocent pages, she was not yet plotting a rebellion. She was simply bearing witness, her pen capturing the subtle cracks in the gilded facade, the small moments of loneliness and isolation that would later form the foundation for a far more dangerous testimony. What began as a personal record of adjustment was, without her even knowing it, the first step in gathering evidence. Every noted slight, every recorded moment of coldness was a piece of a puzzle she did not yet know she was assembling. How does a secret become dangerous? It starts not with a shout, but with a whisper written down in a private book for no one else to see. The first winter at Blenheim was a season of profound isolation. Consuelo's diary entries began to shift, their tone deepening from bewilderment to a quiet, sharp-eyed sorrow. She wrote of the biting cold that the palace's great fireplaces could never truly chase away, a chill that seemed to seep from the very stone walls into her spirit. The initial novelty of royal life had worn off, replaced by the grinding reality of its rules. Every gesture was dictated by protocol, from the way she held her teacup to the exact angle of her curtsy to relatives she had never met. This was not a home, it was a museum, and she felt like one of its newest exhibits, constantly on display and expected to perform flawlessly. Her husband, the Duke, became a spectral figure in her pages. He was often absent, consumed by the management of his estate or his duties in London. When they were together, their conversations were stilted affairs, limited to discussions of household matters or social obligations. The great romantic merger of two dynasties was, in private, a devastating silence. She documented small betrayals, moments where his loyalty to tradition overrode any nascent affection for her. He corrected her American accent in front of guests. He dismissed her suggestions for modernizing parts of their life as frivolous. The man she had married was not a partner, but a warden of the very institution that confined her. The cultural clashes were constant and humiliating. Her vibrant American upbringing, her education, her very way of thinking were treated as charming, but ultimately uncivilized. She wrote of one particularly stinging evening where she attempted to enliven a dinner with a story from New York, only to be met with a wall of polite, frozen smiles. Her energy was seen as a breach of decorum, her intelligence as a peculiarity. The diary became her only confidant, the one place where she could be fully herself without judgment. In its pages, she questioned everything. Was this the pinnacle of society, this cold, rigid performance? Was a title worth the slow erosion of one's own soul? Each entry was another crack in the magnificent facade, a detailed record of how a gilded cage, for all its splendor, is still a prison. The leather-bound diary was no longer just a record of loneliness. It became a secret ledger of forbidden alliances. In the suffocating silence of palace life, Consuelo Vanderbilt began to seek out voices that the court had deemed unacceptable. Her most trusted confidante was not a duchess, but her own lady's maid, a sharp-witted woman from a working-class background who saw the aristocracy not with awe, but with a clear-eyed understanding of its inequalities. During long hours of dressing and undressing, the maid would share stories of the world beyond the palace gates, tales of labor unrest, and the growing cry for social reform. Consuelo did not just listen. She wrote these conversations down, her pen capturing a perspective that was utterly absent from her husband's dinner table. She recorded the maid's plain spoken wisdom, her observations on the vast gulf between the lives of the served and the servants. These were not the kind of secrets that involved state documents or clandestine meetings, but they were revolutionary in their own right. They were the lived experiences of the people the monarchy was meant to rule, documented by a woman who was now part of that monarchy. Beyond the palace staff, she cultivated friendships with a new breed of aristocrat, younger sons and daughters of noble families who themselves were rebelling against tradition. They were the bohemians, the artists, the ones who questioned the very foundations of their inherited privilege. At secretive London salons and during country house weekends, when the Duke was away, she found herself in animated discussions about women's suffrage and Irish home rule, topics that were considered deeply radical and borderline treasonous in her official circles. She meticulously noted the arguments, the passionate rhetoric, and the names of those who dared to speak against the crown's policies. Most dangerously of all, she formed a close, emotionally charged bond with a dashing French diplomat, a man known for his liberal views and his disregard for staid English customs. Their conversations, often held during long walks in the garden or in hastily scribbled letters, were filled with intellectual and romantic tension. He spoke to her of European politics, of republicanism, of a future where a person's worth was not determined by their title. In her diary, he was not just a friend. He was a symbol of everything her life lacked: passion, respect, and a meeting of minds. She recorded their flirtations, his criticisms of the British establishment, and her own growing agreement with him. Each of these relationships was a separate act of defiance, a thread pulled from the tightly woven fabric of her royal duty. And with every entry, she was not just documenting her personal escape. She was compiling a dossier on the very people and ideas that threatened the world she had been bought to represent. What began as a search for companionship was transforming into a political education, all carefully preserved in a locked book that now held the power to ignite a firestorm. Her private diary began to fill with the political whispers of a nation. Within the echoing halls of Blenheim and the hushed drawing rooms of London, Consuelo Vanderbilt was perfectly positioned to overhear conversations meant only for aristocratic ears. She started to document the unvarnished opinions of her husband and his powerful friends on matters of state. These were not the sanitized statements released to the press, but the raw, often cynical, private views of the ruling class. She wrote down their candid thoughts on the rising labor movement, dismissing union leaders as rabble-rousers. She recorded their deep anxieties about the growing calls for Irish independence, fears rooted not in the welfare of the people, but in the potential loss of land and political control. The diary became a secret transcript of the establishment's true voice, a voice that often contradicted its own public image of benevolent authority. Her own American perspective gave her a unique lens through which to view these discussions. Where her English counterparts saw tradition and order, she began to see stubbornness and a refusal to adapt. She privately questioned the government's foreign policy, particularly its colonial ambitions, noting the human cost that was so casually glossed over in polite company. One chilling entry described a dinner party where a high-ranking minister joked about a recent military action overseas, treating the lives of distant peoples as mere pawns on a geopolitical chessboard. Consuelo did not laugh. She simply went back to her room and wrote it all down, her pen capturing the casual cruelty that underpinned so much of the empire's logic. Most dangerously, she was sometimes privy to confidential discussions about the monarchy itself. The palace walls were not as soundproof as the old families believed. She overheard debates about the king's health and the potential for a succession crisis, conversations that were considered state secrets. She recorded the private frustrations of courtiers who found the heir to the throne too modern and unpredictable. She even wrote down snippets of gossip about royal finances, the delicate matter of how the crown funded its extravagant lifestyle amidst a changing world. These were not just secrets, they were vulnerabilities, and by recording them, she was inadvertently mapping the weak points of the entire institution. Her diary was no longer just a personal chronicle of a lonely bride. It was evolving into a confidential briefing on the frailties of the British elite. What happens when the most intimate fears and biases of the powerful are written down by someone they never thought to watch? The diary's pages began to reveal a rot at the very heart of the institution. Consuelo's pen turned from her own loneliness to document the private vices of the king and his inner circle. Secrets so damaging they could shatter the public's carefully crafted image of royal virtue. She wrote not as a scandalized outsider, but as a quiet observer within the palace walls, her entries detailing a world of excess and hypocrisy hidden behind the velvet ropes. She chronicled the king's ruinous gambling habits, noting the vast sums lost in private card games that stretched into the early morning. These were not friendly wagers, but debts so large they required discreet financial maneuvering, with funds quietly diverted from estate revenues to settle the royal markers. The diary recorded the hushed, anxious conversations between courtiers, their fear that a single unlucky night could trigger a financial and public relations disaster. The monarch, presented to the public as a pillar of stability, was in private a man enslaved by chance. Beyond the gambling tables, she documented a troubling reliance on substances. She wrote of the special tonics and potent sedatives that were a regular part of the royal regimen, used to calm nerves or induce sleep after nights of excess. There were detailed accounts of lavish dinners where the champagne flowed too freely, leading to slurred speeches and indiscreet behavior from figures who were meant to embody national dignity. The diary captured the stark contrast between the sober, dutiful figure seen at public events and the faltering, sometimes volatile individual behind the throne. Most explosive of all were the records of illicit affairs. Consuelo did not deal in vague rumors. She named names and described encounters. She wrote of the king's long-standing mistress, a woman who wielded significant influence behind the scenes, her opinions often shaping royal policy more than any minister's counsel. She documented the comings and goings at certain London townhouses, the secret assignations at country estates, and the network of loyal servants paid handsomely for their silence. These were not fleeting indiscretions, but parallel lives maintained with breathtaking audacity. The moral code the monarchy publicly championed was, within the private world Consuelo described, a hollow joke. Every entry on this topic was a direct assault on the foundation of the crown's authority, which was built not just on power, but on the perceived moral superiority of the royal family. How could a man who could not govern his own passions be trusted to govern a nation? The diary was no longer just a personal journal. It was a ledger of moral bankruptcy, and its existence meant that the most powerful man in the land was living on borrowed time and on borrowed virtue. The diary's most incendiary pages were reserved for a Frenchman, whose name she dared not write in full. It was an affair conducted in the stolen moments between official duties, a romance built on whispered conversations and the electric thrill of being truly seen. While her husband, the Duke, was preoccupied with estate business or his own distant pursuits, Consuelo found solace in the company of a charismatic diplomat from Paris. Their connection was immediate and profound, a meeting of minds that her arranged marriage had never offered. He spoke to her of art, of philosophy, of a world beyond the stifling traditions of the English court, and in her writing, he became simply C, a single, potent initial that held all her suppressed passion and longing. Their secret meetings were meticulously planned and recorded in her journal with the precision of a military campaign. They would encounter one another by apparent chance during afternoon walks in the sprawling grounds of a country house where other guests were staying. She described the specific bend in the river where he would be waiting, the particular grove of oak trees that offered a curtain of privacy. Sometimes their assignations were even more daring, taking place in a secluded London garden square under the dim glow of gaslight, far from the prying eyes of Mayfair. Every detail was noted: the rustle of her silk skirts as she hurried to meet him, the faint scent of his cologne on the evening air, the way his hand would gently brush hers as he helped her over a stile. These were not just romantic encounters. They were acts of rebellion, each one a silent rejection of the life she had been forced to adopt. Communication between these meetings was a delicate dance of coded messages. A particular book left on a specific table in the palace library signaled that she had received his last letter. A certain type of flower arranged in a vase in her sitting room conveyed a prearranged time for their next tryst. Her lady's maid, a trusted accomplice, became the essential courier, slipping folded notes into her glove or retrieving messages left under a specific bench in the park. The diary chronicled the constant, gnawing fear of discovery, the way her heart would pound at the sight of a stern-faced footman, wondering if he was merely performing his duties or if he was her husband's spy. She lived in a state of heightened awareness, where every glance and every overheard snippet of conversation felt like a potential threat to her fragile happiness. Amid the thrill, her writing captured a deep and wrenching emotional turmoil. One entry would overflow with euphoric descriptions of his words, the feeling of her spirit finally awakening after a long winter. The very next page could plunge into a pit of guilt and self-recrimination, questioning the morality of her actions and the devastating scandal that would erupt if they were exposed. She wrote of the painful duality of her existence, playing the serene duchess by day, while her heart and mind were entangled in a dangerous secret by night. The diary became her confessional, the only place where she could reconcile the woman society demanded her to be with the woman she truly was. She questioned everything. Was this love, or merely a desperate grasp for freedom? Was she brave, or simply reckless? Each word written about C was a gamble, a piece of evidence that could destroy not only her reputation, but also destabilize the diplomatic relations between two powerful nations. In documenting this illicit love, she was not just risking her marriage. She was placing a lit match next to the gunpowder keg of European politics. Her pen now turned to the cold, hard numbers that propped up the crown. Consuelo's diary began to meticulously detail a financial web of astonishing corruption, exposing how the monarchy's public dignity was funded by private deceit. She recorded her husband's quiet confessions and the hushed arguments she overheard, revealing a desperate scramble for money that knew no ethical bounds. The most shocking revelation was the systematic misappropriation of state funds. Money designated for public works or the maintenance of royal palaces was quietly diverted into private accounts, used to cover the king's immense gambling debts or to finance the lavish lifestyles of certain court favorites. She wrote of one specific instance where funds allocated for the restoration of a historic public monument were instead used to gild the interiors of a private hunting lodge, a secret known only to a handful of trusted advisors, and now to her. Even more personal and more galling was the secret borrowing from her own fortune. Her immense dowry, the very reason for her marriage, was not simply used for the restoration of Blenheim as promised. The Duke, under pressure from the crown, had taken substantial loans from her family's wealth to cover royal shortfalls. These were not formal agreements, but frantic, discreet requests for liquidity, framed as a patriotic duty to stabilize the monarchy itself. Her own money, the product of American industry, was being used to paper over the fiscal irresponsibility of an ancient dynasty. She felt like a silent banker to a failing enterprise, her fortune vanishing into a bottomless pit of royal privilege. The diary also named names, detailing the crown's corrupt dealings with powerful industrialists and bankers. In exchange for generous loans or silent investments, these men received priceless favors. She documented conversations where titles of nobility were essentially auctioned off, with a baronetcy offered in return for writing off a substantial debt. She wrote of lucrative government contracts for railways or shipbuilding being steered towards certain families who had extended lines of credit to the cash-strapped monarchy. The sacred honor of the crown was being bartered in back rooms, its authority sold to the highest bidder. This was not just greed, it was a fundamental betrayal of the public trust, a revelation that the institution at the heart of the nation was, in its private dealings, morally bankrupt. Every entry in this section of the diary transformed its pages from a personal chronicle into a forensic audit of a decaying power. What is the true cost of a crown when its price is paid not in loyalty, but in secret debts and corrupt bargains? The diary's gaze turned toward the nursery, and what it saw threatened the very future of the crown. Consuelo began to document the private anxieties swirling around the royal heirs, the young men and women being groomed to lead the nation. Her pages revealed a family in quiet crisis, riven by doubts that never reached the public ear. She recorded the king's own private lamentations about his eldest son and heir, a man more interested in a life of pleasure than in the burdens of statecraft. The monarch confessed, within the privacy of his inner circle, a terrifying fear that the prince was simply not fit for the throne, that his frivolity masked a fundamental lack of character and intellect. These were not the proud pronouncements of a father, but the terrified whispers of a ruler who saw the end of his line. The diary captured the stark favoritism shown to a younger sibling, a child deemed more serious and reliable. Consuelo wrote of lavish gifts and private praise showered upon this second son, while the heir was subjected to constant, belittling criticism. This parental bias was not just a family matter, it was a political fault line. By creating a favorite, the king was inadvertently fostering a rivalry that could split the court and destabilize the succession itself. How could a dynasty survive when its own patriarch questioned the capability of his successor? The scandals of the younger generation were even more damaging. Consuelo's entries detailed the reckless behavior of a particular princess, whose name was linked to a series of controversial figures from the world of finance and entertainment. She recorded the frantic efforts of courtiers to cover up the princess' substantial gambling debts, paid off with funds from a secret account to avoid public disgrace. Another entry described a young duke, a cousin to the heir, whose involvement in a failed business venture had hints of fraud, a situation requiring the family's lawyers to intervene discreetly to prevent a court case. Every page peeled back another layer of the myth of royal infallibility, showing a new generation that was not nobler or wiser, but just as flawed and vulnerable to temptation as their parents. The institution's survival depended on the public's belief in a seamless, dignified transfer of power from one capable generation to the next. Consuelo's diary proved that behind the palace walls, that belief was a carefully maintained fiction, and the people next in line for the throne were the greatest liability of all. The most damning testimony did not come from diplomats or dukes, but from the people who silently polished the silver and swept the ashes from the hearth. Consuelo Vanderbilt, in her profound isolation, discovered that the palace servants were the true chroniclers of its secrets. They moved through the grand halls like ghosts, privy to every unguarded moment, every whispered confession, and every private vice. Her diary became a repository for their ground-level view of the monarchy, a perspective stripped of all pageantry and pretense. She documented her growing friendship with her own lady's maid, a woman of sharp intelligence who saw the aristocracy not as superiors, but as deeply flawed individuals. During the intimate ritual of dressing, the maid would share the palace's true news, stories that never made it into the society pages. She revealed which footman had been paid to deliver a secret letter to a mistress, which valet was tasked with discreetly disposing of empty brandy bottles from a royal apartment at dawn, in which cook was ordered to prepare rich, decadent meals for the king while he publicly praised the virtues of a simple diet. This was not malicious gossip. It was the unvarnished logistics of hypocrisy, and Consuelo wrote it all down. She recorded the servants' quiet contempt for the waste they witnessed every day, the trays of uneaten food discarded while families in the nearby village struggled to find work. She noted their cynical laughter about the public image of marital harmony presented by certain noble couples, when the staff knew they maintained separate bedrooms and communicated only through written notes. The servants knew which lords borrowed money from their own butlers, and which ladies were cruel to their staff behind closed doors after presenting a face of gentle benevolence at a charity event. This insider knowledge provided a devastatingly complete picture. The monarchy was not a well-oiled machine of state, but a collection of fallible people whose private lives were a constant, frantic effort to maintain a lie. The servants saw the cracks because they were the ones ordered to plaster them over each morning. By giving their testimony a permanent home in her journal, Consuelo was assembling evidence from the one source the aristocracy never thought to monitor: the people they considered part of the furniture. How do you dismantle a myth? You start by listening to the people who clean up after the magicians. The diary escaped its gilded prison in the pocket of a trusted lady's maid. It was a damp Tuesday morning when the small, leather-bound volume, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with string, left Blenheim Palace for the last time. The maid carried it not amongst her own belongings, which were subject to search, but hidden within a basket of soiled linens destined for a specialist laundry in London. Her hands did not shake, but her heart hammered against her ribs with every step she took past the stoic footman at the service entrance. She was not just carrying a book. She was carrying a live bomb, and she knew it. The plan had been carefully constructed during hushed conversations in Consuelo's private sitting room. The maid's brother, a printer with sympathies for the growing reform movement, was the intended recipient. He understood the power of information and had connections to people who could make the diary's contents matter far beyond the palace walls. This was not an act of vengeance for the maid, but one of solidarity. She had seen her mistress' quiet suffering and had come to respect the intelligence behind the lonely eyes. She believed the truth, however dangerous, deserved a chance to be heard. The diary's journey did not end at the printer's shop. Within days, it fell into the hands of a radical lawyer, a man who saw in its pages not just a personal tragedy, but a political weapon of unimaginable force. He was the first to truly grasp its potential. He did not want to publish it immediately; that would be too crude, too final. Instead, he saw it as the ultimate form of leverage. His initial attempts were subtle, almost elegant. A carefully worded letter referencing a specific financial indiscretion detailed on page 47 was sent to a high-ranking court official. It contained no overt threat, only a pointed question about fiscal responsibility. The intent was clear: a demonstration of knowledge, a quiet show of force. The palace's response was not a written reply, but a sudden, unexplained delay in a piece of legislation the lawyer had been publicly opposing. It was a small concession, a test, but it proved the diary's power. The secrets were no longer confined to paper. They were now a currency, traded in the shadowy economy of influence and fear. The lawyer then took a more daring step. He arranged a clandestine meeting with a representative of the crown, a man known for handling the monarchy's most delicate affairs. In a private room above a London coffeehouse, the lawyer did not brandish the diary. He merely quoted from it. He recited the king's own private doubts about his heir, word for word. He mentioned the exact amount secretly borrowed from the Vanderbilt fortune to cover a recent gambling debt. The court representative turned pale. This was no longer about influencing a single bill. This was about the survival of the monarchy itself. The lawyer's demand was simple: a seat at the table, a voice in the process, a promise of reform. He was not asking for money. He was asking for power, using the diary as his key. The very existence of the book had created a terrifying new reality. For the first time, the crown was not dictating terms. It was negotiating for its life, with a common lawyer who held its most intimate secrets in his hands. The private confessions of a lonely duchess had become the most dangerous file in the kingdom. The radical lawyer knew his own hands were too small to hold such a dangerous truth forever. He needed a bigger institution, one with the power to print and distribute words to the masses. His first approach was to the editor of a prominent London newspaper, a man known for his reformist leanings and his disdain for aristocratic privilege. The meeting was held in the editor's private office, the air thick with cigar smoke and the faint smell of printing ink. The lawyer placed a single typewritten page on the desk, a carefully curated excerpt from the diary detailing the secret financial arrangements between the crown and certain industrialists. For a long moment, the editor said nothing, his eyes scanning the lines again and again. He understood the historical significance instantly, but he also saw the abyss that opening this door would create. The ethical debate that followed was not about truth, but about consequence. One faction within the newspaper argued passionately for publication, declaring it a moral duty to expose corruption at the highest level. They saw the diary as a catalyst for the very reform the nation needed. But the opposing faction, led by the paper's aging owner, was terrified. He spoke of the chaos that would follow, the potential collapse of public faith in all institutions, and the very real possibility of riots in the streets. This was not just a story, it was a grenade, and pulling the pin could destroy the thrower as well as the target. The legal threats from the palace arrived before the editor had even made his final decision. They did not come through official channels, but were delivered by a discreet gentleman caller who represented the crown's most formidable lawyers. The message was not a request, but a promise. If a single word from that diary was published, the full force of the state would come down upon the newspaper. They would be sued for libel on a scale never before seen, their printing presses seized, and every individual involved in the decision would face personal ruin and imprisonment for sedition. The threat was absolute and designed to strangle the story in its cradle. Undeterred, the lawyer then turned to a book publisher known for producing serious, weighty political volumes. The publisher, a man of principle but also of business, saw the diary not just as a manuscript, but as the most valuable and dangerous property he had ever been offered. His dilemma was even more profound. A book would have permanence. A newspaper article could be dismissed as sensationalism, but a bound volume sitting on library shelves, would become part of the historical record. He spent a sleepless night reading the entire transcript, his excitement warring with a cold dread. He calculated the potential sales, enough to make him wealthy for life, but he also calculated the cost. His small publishing house would be crushed by the legal onslaught. His authors would abandon him. His name would be synonymous with treason. The palace's response to this new threat was even more sinister. Instead of a direct legal threat, they deployed social and financial pressure. The publisher's primary banker, a man with deep ties to the aristocracy, paid him a personal visit, politely mentioning that certain lines of credit would be withdrawn if he proceeded. Friends of the royal family suddenly canceled their subscriptions to his other publications. A whisper campaign began in London's clubs, suggesting the man was unstable, a radical who could not be trusted. They were isolating him, making him an outcast before he had even committed the crime. The diary's existence had created a silent war fought in back rooms and private clubs, a battle between the power of the press and the immovable force of the crown. Could the truth survive when the system was designed to bury it alive? The first whisper of the diary's escape sent a tremor through the palace that was felt in its deepest foundations. A coded telegram, a frantic message from a loyalist in London, reached the king's private secretary, and within the hour, the monarch himself was informed. His reaction was not one of anger, but of pure, undiluted panic. The public image of a confident, benevolent ruler shattered in the privacy of his study, replaced by the terrified calculation of a man who could see his own downfall written in another's hand. The Crown's lawyers were summoned for an emergency meeting that lasted through the night, their voices hushed and grim as they discussed the legal avenues for suppression. Every page of that diary was a landmine, and the lawyer holding it had his finger on the trigger. Their first, frantic instinct was to destroy the source. A secret directive was issued to discredit Consuelo Vanderbilt in the most brutal way possible. Courtiers who had once smiled at her in the drawing room now began a vicious whispering campaign. They spread stories in London's most exclusive clubs, suggesting the Duchess was hysterical, a woman of unstable American nerves who had fabricated a fantasy of persecution. They hinted that her complaints were the delusions of a neglected wife, her observations the ravings of a mind unhinged by loneliness. It was a classic strategy to attack the messenger when you cannot dispute the message, and they wielded the weapon of reputation with ruthless precision. Simultaneously, a more sinister operation was launched to retrieve the physical manuscript. Agents of the Crown, men who operated in the shadows beyond the official police force, were dispatched. Their mission was to locate the diary and secure it by any means necessary. They attempted to infiltrate the radical lawyer's circle, posing as sympathetic publishers. They put pressure on the maid's family, suggesting her brother, the printer, might face sudden, ruinous inspections from the tax authorities if he did not cooperate. One evening, the lawyer returned to his office to find the lock expertly picked, his papers meticulously searched but left in perfect order, a silent and terrifying message that he was being watched. The palace was trying to erase the truth, not by denying it, but by making it disappear before a single soul could read it. They operated with the desperate energy of an institution that knew its survival was at stake, proving that the most dangerous secrets are not those that are spoken, but those that are written down and threatened to be read. How far will power go to silence a single, truthful voice? The Crown's legal assault began with a thunderous silence, a sealed injunction delivered to the radical lawyer's doorstep before the morning papers had even been printed. The monarchy was not requesting, it was commanding. Every word from Consulo's diary was now legally deemed the property of the Crown, a state secret whose exposure would threaten the very security of the nation. The argument presented in the High Court was a masterclass in old world authority. The Crown's lawyers, their wigs pristine and voices dripping with patrician disdain, did not even address the diary's specific accusations of gambling or corruption. They soared above such grubby details, framing the case in epic, existential terms. The diary, they argued, contained private conversations about matters of state, discussions of royal succession, and candid assessments of foreign leaders. To publish such material would be to shatter the necessary mystique of the monarchy, to cripple its ability to conduct diplomacy, and to invite chaos from enemies abroad and radicals at home. National stability, they claimed, rested on a foundation of discreet silence, and this book was a sledgehammer aimed directly at it. The public's right to know ended where the nation's safety began. The courtroom itself became a theater of power. The judge, a man whose own career was intertwined with the establishment, listened with a face of stone. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and anxiety. When the radical lawyer rose to speak, he presented a completely different vision of the nation. He argued that true national security was not built on hidden corruption, but on public trust. How could a people be loyal to an institution that secretly mocked them, that bartered their honors, and that lived by a different set of laws? The diary, he contended, was not a threat to the nation, but a diagnosis of a sickness at its very heart. The public interest demanded exposure, not to destroy the country, but to save it from the rot of its own leaders. He did not shout. He simply held up a single typewritten page and read a short, devastating entry detailing the king's own cynical view of his subjects. The gasp in the room was not loud, but it was palpable. The legal battle became a war of injunctions and appeals, a dizzying paper chase through the labyrinth of the British legal system. No sooner would the lawyer find a sympathetic court than the Crown's attorneys would secure another, higher injunction, freezing all possibility of publication. They argued the case was too sensitive for a public trial, demanding it be heard in a secret, star chamber proceeding. The goal was not to win on the merits, but to exhaust, to delay, and to bury the truth under a mountain of legal procedure and endless cost. The lawyer, funded by a handful of anonymous backers, fought on, but each day the diary remained locked away was a victory for the palace. Could the law, an instrument of the state, ever truly be used to condemn the state itself? The courtrooms of London had become the new front line in a war for the soul of a nation, fought not with swords, but with parchment and sealing wax. A quiet tremor began to ripple through the public consciousness long before a single page of the diary was printed. The first whispers of its existence were like sparks landing on dry tinder, igniting a fierce and immediate division across the nation. in the cozy parlors of staunch monarchists. The very idea was dismissed as a vile fabrication, a treasonous fantasy concocted by radicals to undermine 1,000 years of tradition. They spoke of the sacred bond between the sovereign and his people, a trust that could not be broken by the scribblings of a disgruntled foreigner. To them, the diary was not a document, but a weapon of social chaos, and defending the crown was a patriotic duty. Meanwhile, in the meeting halls of reformers and the crowded pubs of the working class, the rumors were met with a hungry, eager excitement. For them, the diary confirmed everything they had long suspected. It gave shape to their vague resentments about inequality and unearned privilege. Here, at last, was proof that the glittering world of the aristocracy was not just different, but morally bankrupt. The idea that a king could gamble away fortunes while children worked in factories was no longer a theory. It was a whispered fact waiting for confirmation. The public square fractured into two armed camps, one defending the institution at all costs, the other desperate for the truth to be set free, no matter the consequence. The press, sensing a story that could redefine the era, began to shape the narrative with masterful and often ruthless skill. Newspapers loyal to the establishment launched a campaign of character assassination against Consuelo. They painted her as a hysterical woman, a spoiled American heiress who could not understand the solemn responsibilities of her position. Their articles questioned her mental stability and her motives, framing her not as a witness, but as a vengeful fantasist. In stark opposition, the reformist papers took a different tack. They carefully avoided printing the diary's specific allegations, which were still legally forbidden. Instead, they wrote in broad, stirring strokes about the public's right to know, about the corrosion of virtue in high places, and about the need for a new moral compact between the governed and their governors. They published impassioned editorials asking their readers pointed, rhetorical questions. Should a nation be ruled by a family or by laws? Can a man who is not honest in his private dealings be trusted with the public good? They were not reporting the story, they were preparing the ground for it, framing the eventual revelation not as a scandal, but as a necessary reckoning. This media war turned every breakfast table into a courtroom, with each citizen serving as judge and jury over a truth they had not yet even seen. The battle for the diary was no longer confined to lawyers and courtrooms. It was now a battle for the soul of every person in the street, a quiet civil war fought with headlines and whispers, setting the stage for a confrontation that would shake the nation to its core. The first piece of the diary appeared not in a newspaper, but as an anonymous pamphlet, its plain cover belying the explosive contents within. The radical lawyer had chosen his weapon with surgical precision, leaking a single, devastating excerpt that detailed the secret financial arrangement between the crown and a prominent railway magnate. It described how a title of baronet had been quietly promised in exchange for the erasure of a monumental gambling debt. This was not a vague accusation of corruption. It was a specific transaction with names, dates, and amounts, all rendered in Consuelo's unmistakably observant prose. The strategy was a masterstroke, testing the waters with a scandal that was not about illicit love or personal vice, but about the cold, hard selling of honor. It was a crime the common person could understand instantly, the aristocracy auctioning off its most sacred symbols for cash. The public reaction was not a slow burn, it was an explosion. Newsboys on every street corner shouted the headlines, their voices cracking with excitement. The pamphlet sold out within hours, passing from hand to hand in factories, pubs, and shops. For the first time, people were not just hearing rumors. They were reading the private words of an insider who confirmed their deepest suspicions. The establishment press was caught completely off guard, forced to report on a document they could no longer ignore. Their initial attempts to dismiss it as a forgery crumbled under the weight of its meticulous detail. The palace issued a terse statement denying any wrongdoing, but the denial felt hollow, a desperate shout into a gathering storm. This first leak created a template for all that followed. Another excerpt soon surfaced, this one focusing on the king's private contempt for his own ministers, quoting his cruel nicknames for them and his dismissal of their counsel as the prattling of fools. Then came the record of the diverted public funds, money meant for a veterans' hospital siphoned to refurbish a royal yacht. Each new revelation was like another crack in a massive dam, and with each crack, the public's outrage grew louder and more unified. The press frenzy became self-sustaining, with artists sketching imagined scenes from the diary and editorialists writing fiery condemnations. The public square was now consumed by a single, deafening question. If this was the truth they had been allowed to see, what even darker secrets remained locked away in the diary's full, unpublished pages? The scandal did not respect borders. As the diary's contents filtered out of Britain, foreign embassies in London worked through the night, encoding frantic dispatches for their home governments. In Paris, newspaper headlines screamed about Anglo-Saxon hypocrisy, gleefully reprinting the most salacious details of the king's gambling and his court's financial corruption. French editors, long accustomed to their own Republican ideals, framed the crisis as the inevitable collapse of a decadent and outdated monarchy. Across the Channel, the German Kaiser and his ministers viewed the turmoil with a far more calculating eye. Their confidential reports analyzed the British monarchy not as a moral failing, but as a geopolitical vulnerability. A weakened, distracted Britain, its leadership consumed by domestic scandal, was a strategic opportunity. They quietly began to recalculate their diplomatic and military positions, wondering if the entire balance of power in Europe was about to shift because of one woman's private journal. For the other royal families of Europe, the news was met with a cold, familial dread. They saw the British crown not as a rival, but as a cousin institution, and the diary's revelations were a poison that threatened them all. In the palaces of Russia, Austria, and Spain, monarchs summoned their own families and most trusted advisors for urgent, closed-door meetings. The conversation was always the same, a fearful discussion about contagion. If the British public could turn on their king over private vices and secret finances, what was to stop their own subjects from doing the same? They issued strict, private directives to their own courts, ordering a temporary reduction in public extravagance and a renewed emphasis on displays of duty and piety. It was a panicked, coordinated effort to build a firewall, to assure their people that their own monarchies were different, more virtuous, and more secure. Yet behind the brave public faces, a single, terrifying question haunted every crowned head in Europe. If the world's most powerful monarchy could be brought to its knees by a book, were any of them truly safe? The private life of a king was no longer a private matter. It had become the most pressing affair of state. The world she had documented so meticulously now had no place for her. Consuelo Vanderbilt found herself exiled from the very society she had married into. A pariah in the gilded cage she had dared to describe. The palace doors slammed shut, not with a public decree, but with a silence more final than any courtroom verdict. Invitations to the season's most coveted balls and dinners ceased overnight. Former friends, those she had broken bread with in the grandest dining rooms of Europe, now crossed the street to avoid acknowledging her. Her name, once a symbol of a brilliant transatlantic merger, was now a whisper, a cautionary tale about the dangers of a woman who wrote things down. This was not a formal banishment, it was a social death, a chillingly efficient process where she was simply erased from the collective memory of the aristocracy. She retreated from London, the city of her greatest triumphs and deepest humiliations, and sought refuge in the countryside, then later in France, living in a series of elegant but far quieter homes. The frantic energy of court life was replaced by an immense, echoing quiet. Her only companions were a small, loyal staff and the ever-present weight of the scandal she had unleashed. In these years of isolation, the diary was no longer a weapon in a lawyer's hand, but a ghost that haunted her own quiet hours. She reflected on the staggering consequences of her private observations. Had her quest for a truthful record been worth the chaos? The monarchy, though shaken, had survived, its foundations cracked, but not yet collapsed. The king still sat on his throne, his public image permanently tarnished, but his power, for the moment, intact. The true casualty, it seemed, was her own life. The institution had proven itself far more resilient than the individual who challenged it. Yet, in her later years, a different perspective began to emerge from the ruins of her old life. With the clarity that comes only with time and distance, she saw that her act of rebellion, however painful its personal cost, had irrevocably changed the conversation. She had held up a mirror to power, and while the powerful had not liked their reflection, the people had seen it, and they would never forget. The diary had been a spark, and while it had not burned down the palace, it had lit a fuse of public skepticism that would continue to smolder for generations. She had traded her place in the royal circle for a far more uncertain legacy, a permanent question mark in the history books. Was she a traitor to her class or a truth teller for the ages? In the quiet of her exile, she understood that the world would forever debate that question, and that her private words had, in the end, become a part of history itself. The dam finally broke not with a whisper, but with a thunderous roar. After years of legal battles and frantic suppression, the complete diary of Consuelo Vanderbilt was published as a single, devastating volume. It became an overnight sensation, flying off bookstore shelves with a speed that stunned even its most optimistic publishers. The public's appetite for the unvarnished truth was insatiable, and here, at last, was the full course. People from every walk of life devoured its pages, reading not just for scandal, but for a raw, unfiltered look inside a world that had always been shrouded in velvet and mystery. The most explosive passages, those the Crown had fought so desperately to bury, were now available for the price of a book. Readers finally saw the king's own handwriting, reproduced in facsimile, detailing a massive gambling loss on a single night. They consumed the meticulous accounting of how public funds were rerouted to cover private debauchery, with specific line items for everything from jeweled snuff boxes to payments to certain discreet individuals. The diary laid bare the cruel nicknames the monarch used for his own ministers and his chillingly casual disregard for the lives affected by his policies. It was all there: the financial corruption, the illicit affairs, the servants' testimonies, and the profound loneliness at the heart of the Gilded Cage, woven together into a single, undeniable narrative. This was not a leaked excerpt or a partisan pamphlet. It was the entire testimony, and its authority was overwhelming. The public did not just read this book, they absorbed it, discussed it in pubs and parlors, and saw their own suspicions confirmed in heartbreaking detail. The monarchy's carefully constructed image of benevolent authority evaporated overnight, replaced by the far more human and far more damning portrait from the diary. What does it mean when a private confession becomes a public verdict, and an entire nation holds the evidence in its hands? The diary's revelations detonated at the very foundations of the state, sparking a constitutional crisis unlike any the nation had faced in generations. Inside the hallowed halls of Parliament, the air grew thick with attention usually reserved for declarations of war. Legislators who had long paid lip service to the crown now stood before a raucous chamber, their voices trembling not with reverence, but with outrage. For the first time in living memory, the once unthinkable word was spoken aloud in a formal session: abdication. A faction of radical MPs, backed by a surge of public opinion, demanded the king step down immediately, arguing that a monarch who had so thoroughly violated the public trust could no longer serve as the moral anchor of the nation. They quoted directly from the diary's pages, reading the king's own cynical words about his subjects into the official parliamentary record, transforming Consulo's private observations into a public indictment. The government, caught between its duty to the crown and the fury of the people, was thrown into paralysis. Key votes were delayed, the legislative agenda collapsed, and the daily business of running the country ground to a halt as every conversation circled back to the single, overwhelming question of the monarchy's future. This was no longer a scandal. It was a fundamental challenge to the entire system of governance. What is the purpose of a king who has lost the respect of his people? The debate raged from the floor of Parliament to the editorial pages of every newspaper, forcing a national conversation that had been deferred for centuries. The crisis forced the appointment of a royal commission, a special investigative body with the power to subpoena documents and question court officials under oath. Its mandate was sweeping: to examine the finances, the influence, and the very role of the monarchy in a modern state. For weeks, the nation watched as a procession of tight-lipped bankers, flustered courtiers, and even a few brave former servants were compelled to testify. The commission's inquiries, sparked by specific entries in the diary, uncovered a web of financial arrangements that blurred the line between the sovereign's private purse and the public treasury. They confirmed that titles had indeed been discussed in connection with financial favors, and that funds had been quietly moved in ways that defied parliamentary oversight. Each finding chipped away at the mystical authority of the crown, reducing it to an institution that could be audited, investigated, and reformed. The commission's final report did not call for an end to the monarchy, but it did recommend a profound restructuring, demanding full financial transparency, the formal separation of state funds from the sovereign's private wealth, and a new, clearly defined constitutional role that stripped the king of his remaining political influence. The monarchy would survive, but it would never again be the same. It had been forced to submit to the scrutiny of the people it ruled, all because one woman chose to write down what she saw. A century later, the echoes of that locked diary can still be heard in the corridors of modern palaces. The royal tell-all memoir has become a permanent fixture of our era, a recurring nightmare for every public relations team employed by a crown. The fundamental equation remains unchanged. A single insider, armed with pen and paper, can still threaten to destabilize an ancient institution by revealing the human frailties behind the ceremonial mask. The weapons are just different now. A laptop computer instead of a leather-bound journal. A global media ecosystem instead of a clandestine pamphlet network. The speed is terrifying. A digital file can circle the world in seconds, leaving courtiers with no time for secret injunctions or discreet negotiations. The modern royal memoir is not a slow burn. It is a detonation. Consider the recent waves of confessional books from members of various royal houses. They follow the same blueprint Consuelo Vanderbilt unknowingly drafted. They detail the suffocating rigidity of protocol, the isolation felt within a gilded existence, and the profound cultural clashes that occur when an outsider marries into a centuries-old system. These contemporary accounts speak of mental health struggles exacerbated by a relentless press and a rigid institution slow to adapt. They describe the same financial anxieties, though now framed in terms of taxpayer funding and the cost of security details rather than secret loans from industrialists. The core grievance is identical: the conflict between the individual's need for authenticity and the institution's demand for a flawless, impersonal symbol. The palace's response, too, often mirrors the past. Initial attempts to discredit the author, followed by a stony, dignified silence meant to convey that such matters are beneath the crown's attention. Yet the silence is never as powerful as it once was. Not when the author can bypass the traditional media and speak directly to millions on a television special or through social media. The true legacy of Consuelo's diary is the precedent it set. It proved that the mystique of royalty is its greatest shield, and that a truthful, first-person account is the one weapon that can pierce it. Modern monarchies have learned this lesson, often adopting a strategy of calculated transparency, allowing carefully managed documentaries and social media feeds to create an illusion of openness while keeping the truly difficult truths under lock and key. They understand that in an age of instant communication, the threat is not a single book, but the cumulative effect of many voices. A duchess's loneliness in 1900, a prince's resentment in 2020, a princess's account of racism within the palace walls. Each new testimony adds another crack, gradually eroding the foundation of unquestioning deference. The institution survives not by being perfect, but by being perceived as necessary. In every tell-all book forces the public to re-litigate that necessity. The question is no longer whether a king can be shamed into abdication, but whether a monarchy can maintain its relevance in a world that demands accountability from every power, whether held by a president or a prince. How much longer can tradition withstand the relentless pressure of a single, truthful voice, amplified to a global audience? Even after its publication, the diary kept its deepest secrets close. Or the most dangerous truths written in a code only the author could understand. Some historians point to passages filled with seemingly innocent descriptions of the weather or lists of household items, arguing these were clever ciphers. A detailed account of a new floral arrangement in the Grand Hall, for instance, might have been her way of signaling a clandestine meeting, each type of blossom representing a different person or place. Other experts believe the true scandal lies in the diary's physical gaps. There are clear indications that pages were carefully removed, their faint outlines visible in the binding. What was so incendiary that even the brave author felt compelled to tear it out and presumably burn it? Were these the names of other, even more powerful conspirators, or evidence of a crime too terrible to commit to posterity? Then there is the persistent question of her own perspective. Could the loneliness and betrayal she endured have colored her accounts, leading to subtle exaggerations? It is possible that a cold remark from her husband was transformed in her wounded mind into a calculated insult, or that a minister's private joke was misinterpreted as a callous dismissal of human life. Yet the sheer volume of corroborating detail, from financial records to the testimonies of servants, lends a powerful weight to her words. The greatest mystery of all is what we do not know. What other scandals, what other vulnerabilities of the crown were documented in those missing pages or hidden behind that elegant script? The diary, for all it revealed, remains a puzzle box, and its final secret may be that the full truth was far more dangerous than anyone ever dared to print. What do you think was too volatile, too explosive, to even write down? That single leather-bound volume did more than expose a king. It permanently altered the relationship between the powerful and the people. By revealing the profound humanity and all its flaws behind the crown's majestic facade, the diary shattered the myth of inherent royal superiority. Its pages proved that the institution was not divinely ordained, but painfully human, susceptible to the same vices, greed, and frailties as anyone else. This was its most devastating legacy, the demystification of power. It taught the public a crucial lesson that echoes to this day, that no institution is beyond questioning, and that accountability is not a threat to stability, but its very foundation. The monarchy survived, but it was forced to evolve, to become more transparent and constitutionally constrained, forever aware that its legitimacy depended on public consent, not just divine right. This transformation rippled far beyond the palace gates, emboldening reform movements and strengthening the press's role as a public watchdog. The story of Consuelo Vanderbilt's diary is a permanent testament to the revolutionary power of a personal testimony. It demonstrates that the most dangerous weapon against entrenched power is not an army, but a truthful witness. One person, armed with nothing more than a pen and the courage to record what they see, can challenge the mightiest of institutions. In our own time, we must ask ourselves, what are the modern equivalents of that locked diary? What hidden truths, recorded on a smartphone or whispered in a private message, hold the same explosive potential to topple today's titans of industry, politics, or influence. The story reminds us that the balance of power is fragile, and it can always be shifted by a single, truthful voice if we are brave enough to listen.